The deafening crack of a gunshot pierced the silence of the Montana prairie as Constance Whitfield clutched her bleeding side and urged her exhausted mare forward. The year was 1876, and she was running out of both time and hope. Behind her, dust clouds signaled her pursuers weren't far behind the same men who'd murdered her husband 3 days ago and taken everything they owned. Constance's vision blurred as blood seeped through her fingers. The endless expanse of golden grass stretched before her, the distant mountains seeming impossibly far. Her once fine riding dress was torn and stained with the evidence of her desperate flight. At 22, she never imagined she'd be a widow, much less dying alone in this beautiful, merciless wilderness. The mare stumbled, and Constance barely managed to stay mounted. She'd pushed the poor animal beyond endurance. As the horse slowed to a labored walk, Constance felt a strange calm descend. Perhaps this was where her journey ended in dust and fear, with the big sky of Montana as her only witness. The distant thunder of hoofbeats grew louder. Not her pursuers, these came from a different direction. A lone rider appeared on the ridge ahead, silhouetted against the setting sun. The figure approached cautiously, and Constance found herself staring into the weathered face of a man perhaps 5 years her senior. His eyes widened at the sight of her wounds. "Miss, you're hurt bad," he said, his voice deep and steady as he dismounted in one fluid motion. "They're coming," she managed to whisper before sliding from her saddle into darkness. Colton Grayson had seen his share of troubles in his 27 years, but the bleeding woman collapsed in his arms presented an entirely new dilemma. Scanning the horizon, he spotted the dust cloud she'd warned of riders approaching fast from the east. He worked quickly, lifting her onto his horse before securing her mare's reins. As he mounted behind her unconscious form, he felt her blood soaking through his shirt. Whoever was pursuing this woman had already taken enough. He wouldn't let them take her life too. Colton turned his stallion toward the hidden valley where his cabin stood, carefully supporting the woman's limp body against his chest. He could feel her shallow breathing and prayed she'd hold on until he could tend her wound. "Start a new journey in my arms, miss," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I'll keep you safe." The valley was hidden by a narrow pass that few knew existed. By the time he reached his cabin, twilight had deepened into darkness. The woman remained unconscious as he carried her inside and laid her gently on his bed. In the lamplight, he got his first clear look at her face. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, her beauty was unmistakable honey blonde hair escaping a once neat braid, delicate features, and skin that would be fair if not for days in the sun. Her fine clothes, though ruined, spoke of a background far removed from the harsh reality she now faced. Colton set to work cleaning and bandaging her wound. The bullet had grazed her side deeply, but hadn't lodged inside a small mercy. Still, she'd lost considerable blood and fever was setting in. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead and prepared for a long night. At dawn, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were the color of summer sage, he noticed, before they widened in panic. "Easy now," he soothed, gently pressing her shoulders back as she tried to rise. "You're safe here." "Who are you?" Her voice was raspy but determined. "Colton Grayson. Found you half dead on the prairie yesterday." He offered her water, which she accepted with trembling hands. "Mind telling me who's so intent on putting you in the ground?" Pain flashed across her face that had nothing to do with her physical wound. "Logan Blackwood's men. They killed my husband, took our homestead claim. I managed to escape with just—" She stopped, her hand flying to her neck where a simple gold locket hung. "Blackwood," Colton said grimly. "Man's been causing trouble across 3 territories, but you're well hidden here." My place isn't on any map. I'm Constance Whitfield, she offered after a moment. My husband Richard and I came from Boston 6 months ago. Her voice broke. He wanted adventure to build something of our own. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitfield, Colton said quietly. Rest now. We'll figure the rest out when you're stronger. Over the next few days, Constance drifted between sleep and wakefulness as her body fought infection. Colton tended her faithfully, changing bandages and coaxing broth between her lips when she could manage it. His gentle hands belied his rugged appearance, and in her more lucid moments, Constance found herself studying her rescuer. Colton Grayson was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face was handsome in a weathered way, with lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which wasn't often. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to self-reliance. When her fever finally broke on the fourth night, Constance awoke to find him dozing in a chair beside the bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. The cabin was small but neat, with a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and shelves lined with books unexpected in this wilderness setting. "You're staring," Colton said without opening his eyes. Constance flushed. "I'm trying to decide if you're real or if I died after all." That earned a low chuckle as he straightened and opened eyes the color of aged whiskey. "Real enough, Mrs. Whitfield, and you're looking more alive yourself. Please, call me Constance." She pushed herself to a sitting position, wincing at the pull of her healing wound. "I've imposed on your kindness long enough. Once I'm able, I should," she faltered, the reality of her situation crashing down. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. "Should what? Ride back into Blackwood's territory?" Colton shook his head. "Winter's coming on fast. Even if you weren't recovering from a gunshot, crossing the mountains now would be foolish." "I can't stay here indefinitely," she protested. "Why not?" His directness startled her. "I've got the space, and an extra pair of hands is always useful once you're healed up. Come spring, if you still want to leave, I'll help you get wherever you're headed." The offer was practical rather than charitable, and somehow that made it easier to accept. "I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be," he said simply, rising to stoke the fire. "Get some more rest. Tomorrow, if you're up to it, you can join me for a proper meal." As promised, the next day Constance made her way shakily to the table while Colton prepared a breakfast of corn cakes and venison. She'd managed to wash her face and rebraid her hair, though she still wore one of his shirts, her own clothing being beyond salvage. "You mentioned books," she said, nodding toward his shelves as they ate. "Are you a scholar hiding in cowboy clothing?" A smile tugged at his mouth. "Hardly. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She believed education mattered even on the frontier." His expression grew distant. "Lost them both to cholera when I was 16. "I'm sorry," Constance said softly. "My parents are gone too. Father's business failed and the shame killed him. Mother followed a year later." She traced the grain of the wooden table. "Richard was my chance at a new start. He was kind, if somewhat impractical." "How did you end up in Blackwood's path?" Constance sighed. "Richard bought land sight unseen from a man in Helena. When we arrived, we found Blackwood had been using it for grazing his cattle. He claimed the seller had no right to it, but our papers were legitimate." Her hands clenched. "We were building our cabin when his men came. Richard tried to reason with them." Colton reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You don't need to relive it." She met his eyes, finding unexpected understanding there. "Thank you for everything." As days turned to weeks, Constance regained her strength. The cabin was situated in a protected valley with a clear stream running nearby. Pines climbed the surrounding slopes, and a small meadow provided grazing for the horses. Colton had built the place entirely himself over 3 years, including a barn, smokehouse, and root cellar stocked for winter. He was, she discovered, not exactly a cowboy, but something more self-contained: a hunter, trapper, and occasional guide who preferred solitude to the growing settlements. He sold furs and meat in the nearest town twice yearly, trading for supplies he couldn't produce himself. Constance found herself unexpectedly content in this simple existence. She took over cooking and mending, grateful to contribute something in return for his protection. Her city-bred hands grew calloused as she learned to chop wood, tend the vegetable garden's last harvests, and help preserve food for the coming winter. In the evenings, they sat before the fire reading from his collection or simply talking. Colton spoke little of his past beyond his parents, but he shared his knowledge of the land and its creatures freely. Constance told him about Boston, her childhood dreams, and eventually, her brief marriage to Richard, a union based more on mutual need than passion. He wanted to prove himself to his father, she explained one night as snow fell outside. I wanted escape from spinsterhood and poverty. We were fond of each other, but... She trailed off, uncertain how to explain the absence she'd sometimes felt even when Richard was beside her. But you weren't in love, Colton finished for her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. No, she admitted. Is that terrible? It's honest. He placed another log on the fire. Most marriages out here start the same way, practical arrangements. What about you? No practical arrangement tempted you, she asked, suddenly curious about this solitary man. A shadow crossed his face. Once. She chose differently. Constance sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Instead, she asked about his books, and the moment of tension passed. The first heavy snow came in early November, transforming the valley into a glistening wonderland. Constance stood at the cabin door watching fat flakes swirl down, her breath fogging the cold air. Colton joined her, placing a warm woolen shawl around her shoulders, one he'd traded for last time he was in town. It's beautiful, she whispered, awed by the pristine silence. Beautiful but dangerous if you're not prepared, he cautioned. We're well stocked, though. Should be a comfortable winter. The casual "we" warmed her more than the shawl. Over the past weeks, something had shifted between them, a cautious friendship deepening into something neither was ready to name. They moved around each other with increasing ease, anticipating needs, sharing small touches that lingered longer than necessary. That night, a blizzard howled around the cabin. They sat close by the fire, the wind's fury making the sturdy walls seem suddenly fragile. Constance shivered despite the heat. What is it? Colton asked, noticing her discomfort, just thinking how differently things might have ended if you hadn't found me that day. She looked up at him. Why did you help me? You didn't know me, and I brought danger to your doorstep. He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, My sister was 18 when she tried crossing these mountains alone. She'd been mistreated by a man in the last town we lived in. I was away hunting. No one helped her. His voice roughened. Found her grave the next spring. A stranger had buried her proper, at least. Impulsively, Constance took his hand. I'm so sorry, Colton. His fingers tightened around hers. I couldn't save Hannah, but I could save you. The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within her. Before she could respond, he stood abruptly. It's late. We should get some rest. Since her recovery, Constance had been sleeping on a pallet near the fire, insisting Colton reclaim his bed. Tonight, the thought of their separate spaces felt suddenly unbearable. But he was already moving away, the moment lost. The blizzard raged for 3 days, forcing them to remain indoors except for brief trips to check on the animals. The enforced proximity heightened the tension between them. Constance found herself watching Colton's hands as he whittled by the fire, imagining their strength and gentleness on her skin. More than once, she caught him looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. On the fourth morning, they woke to stillness. The storm had passed, leaving waist-deep snow and crystalline blue skies. Colton went to dig paths to the barn and woodpile while Constance prepared breakfast. She was setting the table when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Colton burst through the door, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he ordered, his expression grim. 5 riders coming up the valley. Constance's heart hammered. Blackwood's men, can't tell yet, but nobody finds this place by accident. He checked his weapon. If things go bad, there's a trapdoor under the bearskin rug. Root cellar connects to a tunnel that comes out behind the ridge. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," she protested, his eyes softened briefly. "Not asking you to run yet. Just know the way out if you need it." He positioned himself by the window. "Keep out of sight." The riders approached cautiously. Through a crack in the shutters, Constance could see they were heavily armed, their horses lathered despite the cold. Colton stepped onto the porch, rifle ready but not aimed. "That's far enough," he called. "State your business." The lead rider, a burly man with a scarred face, reined in. "Looking for a woman. Blonde, pretty, stole something valuable from my employer." "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description," Colton replied evenly. "Not many travelers this time of year. Mind if we look around?" "Mr. Blackwood's offering a generous reward." Constance pressed a hand to her mouth. "How had they found her?" "I mind plenty," Colton said, his stance unwavering. "This is private property." The scarred man laughed. "Mighty protective of your privacy, friend. Makes me wonder what you're hiding." "Nothing but my dislike for uninvited guests. Turn around and ride out the way you came." The standoff stretched, tension building. Constance eased the trapdoor open silently, prepared to flee if necessary. But she couldn't leave Colton to face 5 armed men alone. Her eyes fell on the shotgun mounted above the fireplace. Outside, the confrontation escalated. "Last chance to cooperate," the scarred man growled. "The woman's wanted for murder, killed her husband and tried to blame Mr. Blackwood." "That's a lie." Constance couldn't stop herself from flinging open the door, shotgun in hand. "Your boss murdered my husband in cold blood. There she is." Another rider shouted, reaching for his pistol. Colton fired a warning shot into the snow before the man could draw. "Next one won't miss." "Now all of you back away slowly." The scarred man sneered. 2 against 5. "Bad odds, cowboy. Make that 3 against 5, came a new voice from the tree line. A man on a pinto horse emerged, rifle trained on the intruders. 2 more armed riders appeared on the opposite side. "Hello, brother," the newcomer said to Colton without taking his eyes off Blackwood's men. "Thought I'd pay you a winter visit. Brought some friends." Relief washed over Colton's face. "Your timing's impeccable, Charles." The scarred man assessed the changed situation and clearly found it wanting. "This isn't over. Blackwood doesn't forget and he doesn't forgive." "Neither do I," Colton replied coldly. "Tell your boss that Mrs. Whitfield is under my protection now. He comes after her again, he won't live to regret it." With murderous glares, the intruders wheeled their horses and rode away. Colton kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared around the bend. Only then did he turn to Constance, who stood shaking on the porch. "You shouldn't have shown yourself," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only concern. "I couldn't let them spread lies about Richard." She lowered the shotgun. "Or leave you facing them alone." Charles Grayson dismounted and approached with a grin that echoed his brother's rare smiles. "Aren't you going to introduce me to the lady you're protecting so fiercely, Colt?" Proper introductions were made as everyone moved inside to escape the cold. Charles explained that he'd been planning to visit anyway. He made the journey most winters to check on his solitary brother, but had encountered Blackwood's men asking questions in the nearest settlement and grown concerned. They were offering a substantial reward for information about a fugitive woman, Charles explained over coffee. Said she'd murdered her husband and stolen valuable property. The only thing I took was my mother's locket and the clothes on my back, Constance said bitterly. Everything else they stole when they killed Richard. Charles's companions Jacob, a former Army scout, and Marcus, a hunter who often worked with Charles, exchanged glances. Blackwood's been pushing boundaries all across the territory, Jacob said. Intimidating homesteaders, rustling cattle, bribing officials. But murder's a new level even for him. Not new, Colton contradicted. Just not proven before. Man's responsible for at least a dozen deaths I know of, but witnesses have a way of disappearing. Not this time, Constance said firmly. I saw everything. I'd testify if I could get to a proper court. Marcus leaned forward. Spring thaw, we could escort you to Helena. Federal marshal there might listen. That's months away, Charles pointed out. And Blackwood clearly isn't giving up the search. She stays here until spring, Colton said with finality. Nobody knows this valley except us. They found it today, Constance reminded him, because they followed my tracks from checking trap lines, he explained. A mistake I won't repeat. With the snow covering our trail and no more tracks leading in or out, they'll have no way to find this place again. The visitors stayed 3 days, their presence bringing welcome change to the isolated cabin. Charles was more outgoing than his brother but shared the same inherent decency. He told Constance stories of their childhood that made Colton grimace and occasionally correct exaggerated details. On their last evening, while Colton and his friends checked supplies for the journey out, Charles spoke privately with Constance. I've never seen my brother like this, he said, watching Colton through the window. Not since before we lost Hannah. Like what? Constance asked, though something in her already knew. Charles smiled kindly. Like a man who's found something worth living for, not just surviving. He met her eyes directly. He'll never say at first he's too convinced he has nothing to offer a woman like you, but I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one notices. Heat rose in Constance's cheeks. I owe him my life. That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. Charles squeezed her shoulder gently. Just don't break his heart, Mrs. Whitfield. He's had enough loss. After the visitors departed, the cabin seemed strangely empty, despite having returned to its usual occupancy. The encounter with Blackwood's men had shattered their peaceful routine, reminding Constance that her presence endangered Colton. Yet the thought of leaving him twisted painfully in her chest. That evening they sat in silence before the fire, the unspoken tension between them nearly unbearable. Finally, Constance gathered her courage. I should leave when the weather allows, she said softly. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. Colton's head snapped up, his expression unguarded for once. Is that what you want, to leave? No, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But I can't keep risking your life because of my problems. He moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. Constance, look at me. When she did, the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. Your problems became mine the moment I found you bleeding on the prairie. I chose you. Why? She whispered, echoing her question from weeks before, but seeking a different answer now. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Because in all my years alone, I never felt the absence of another person, until you, now the thought of this cabin without you in it. He shook his head, struggling for words. Constance freed one hand to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. I never expected to find safety again, let alone. She hesitated. Let alone, he prompted, hope and fear warring in his expression. Happiness, she finished. You make me happy, Colton. Despite everything, despite the danger and uncertainty, being with you makes me happy. The confession hung between them for a heartbeat before Colton closed the distance, his lips finding hers in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with months of restrained longing. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her from the chair onto his lap as they knelt before the fire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Constance rested her forehead against his. I'm a widow with nothing to offer but complications, she warned. Colton's laugh was low and warm against her skin. And I'm a hermit who talks to his horse more than people. We're quite the pair. She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Yes, we are. That night they shared the bed for the first time, their lovemaking both tender and passionate, a culmination of the trust and affection that had grown between them through danger and daily moments of quiet companionship. Afterward, as Constance lay with her head on Colton's chest, listening to his heartbeat, she felt a sense of homecoming more profound than any she'd experienced before. Richard had been her escape, but Colton was her destination, unexpected, unplanned, and utterly right. What are you thinking? He murmured into her hair. That when you found me, I thought my journey had ended, she replied, but it was just beginning. He tightened his arms around her. I meant what I said to Blackwood's men. You're under my protection now. Not because you need saving anymore, but because I love you, Constance Whitfield. She raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes, finding certainty there that matched her own. And I love you, Colton Grayson. The winter months passed in a cocoon of contentment, the outside world held at bay by deep snow and their shared determination to protect what they'd found. Constance's city-bred sensibilities gradually adapted to frontier life. Colton proved a patient teacher as he showed her how to set snares for rabbits, identify edible plants preserved under the snow, and even shoot with reasonable accuracy. In turn, she brought refinement to their daily existence, not with material comforts, but with the songs and stories she shared, the careful mending that extended the life of their clothing, and the small touches that made the cabin truly a home. She read to him from his books, sometimes discovering he already knew the passages by heart, but enjoyed hearing them in her voice. Their physical relationship deepened alongside their emotional bond. Constance marveled at how different intimacy could be when rooted in genuine love. Where Richard had been considerate but perfunctory, Colton was attentive and passionate, discovering what pleased her with the same patience he brought to tracking a deer through the forest. In late January, a brief thaw allowed them to venture farther from the cabin. Colton took her to a frozen waterfall, crystallized in mid-flow like some magnificent glass sculpture. As they stood admiring it, he turned to her with unusual solemnity. "Been meaning to ask you something," he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Come spring, when we deal with Blackwood afterward, I mean, would you consider staying? Not just until it's safe, but permanently." Constance's breath caught. "Are you asking me to marry you, Colton Grayson?" "Doing a poor job of it," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. From his pocket, he produced a simple band fashioned from silver. "Made this while you were sleeping. It's not fancy, it's perfect," she interrupted, her eyes filling with tears as she extended her hand. "And yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. As he gathered her into his arms, snowflakes began to fall again, dusting their shoulders and hair with delicate crystals. "Might have to wait for a preacher," he murmured against her lips. "Unless you want Charles to read the service from my Bible." Constance laughed. "I'd marry you this instant if I could, but I suppose waiting for a proper ceremony is the respectable thing to do." His eyes darkened with desire. Never claimed to be respectable. They barely made it back to the cabin before passion overcame them both, their lovemaking charged with the promise of a shared future. February brought bitter cold and the first stirrings of worry about Blackwood. Though no more intruders had appeared, Colton took precautions varying his hunting routes, setting alarms of tin cans on strings around the property's perimeter, keeping weapons always close at hand. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, Constance woke to find Colton's side of the bed empty. She found him by the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. He set the weapon aside and drew her onto his lap. "Just being cautious." She nestled against him, inhaling the familiar scent of pine and leather that clung to his skin. "We can't live in fear forever." "No," he agreed, stroking her hair. "Come spring, we'll end this, one way or another." "How?" she asked quietly. "Blackwood has money, men, influence. And we have the truth." Colton's voice was firm. "Plus Charles has been spreading word about what happened to your husband. People are getting tired of Blackwood's methods." Constance wasn't entirely convinced but took comfort in his certainty. "And after? What will our life be like?" The question seemed to please him. He painted a vision of their future expanding the cabin, perhaps building a proper ranch over time. Children someday, if she wanted them. Seasons flowing one into the next, marked by the rhythms of the land rather than society's calendar. "It won't be an easy life," he cautioned. "Not like Boston." "I don't want easy," she replied. "I want real. I want you." March brought the first real signs of spring, longer days, melting snowdrifts, and birds returning to the valley. With the changing season came increasing tension, as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Blackwood. True to his word, Charles returned as soon as the mountain passes were clear enough to travel, bringing news that made their blood run cold. Blackwood had put a price on both their heads now, claiming Colton had abducted Constance and was holding her against her will. "It's his way of legitimizing the hunt," Charles explained grimly. "Makes his men look like heroes instead of hired killers." "We need to take the fight to him," Colton insisted. "End this before he sends more men." Charles shook his head. "That's exactly what he wants to draw you out. Better to get Constance to Helena, let her testify. Marshal Jenkins is honest, and he's been looking for a reason to move against Blackwood." The brothers argued late into the night, with Constance finally intervening. "It has to be my choice," she said firmly, "and I choose to testify. Not just for Richard's justice, but for everyone Blackwood has hurt." The plan was set. Charles would return to town, ostensibly alone, while secretly arranging for a group of trusted men to meet them at a designated point halfway to Helena. Colton and Constance would leave at dawn 2 days later, taking a little-known route through the mountains. Their last night in the cabin was bittersweet. They made love with desperate tenderness, both aware of the dangers ahead yet unwilling to voice their fears. "When this is over," Colton promised as they lay entwined, "we'll build a life so good it makes all of this worthwhile." Constance kissed him deeply. "We already have." They departed before sunrise, traveling light and fast. The journey was arduous, especially for Constance who, despite months of increasing strength, still wasn't accustomed to long hours in the saddle. Colton set a punishing pace, wanting to reach the meeting point by nightfall. The ambush came in mid-afternoon, as they crossed a narrow ravine. The first shot splintered bark inches from Constance's head. Colton reacted instantly, pulling her from the saddle and behind a fallen log as more bullets whined overhead. "How many?" she gasped, heart pounding. "At least 3, he replied, peering cautiously over their shelter. Up on the ridge. Must have been watching the trail. Nowhere to run, she realized, the steep walls of the ravine trapping them. Colton's expression hardened. Then we fight. He pressed his spare pistol into her hands. Stay low. When I draw their fire, work your way to those rocks. Before she could protest, he fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge and sprinted for a different position. As expected, the ambushers concentrated on him, allowing Constance to reach better cover. The exchange of gunfire seemed to last forever. Colton was a superb marksman, but their attackers had the advantage of higher ground. A bullet grazed his arm, another tore through his hat. Constance managed one careful shot when a man exposed himself too long, her aim true enough to send him scrambling back. Then, miraculously, new gunfire erupted, not aimed at them but at their attackers. Shouts of confusion echoed from the ridge. "Colton," Charles's voice carried down, "we've got them surrounded." The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun. 2 of Blackwood's men were dead, another wounded and captured. Charles and his companions, a larger group than expected, had arrived hours ahead of schedule after spotting smoke from the ambushers' morning campfire. "Lucky for us you're paranoid enough to leave a day early," Charles told his brother as they bound the prisoner's wounds. "Not paranoia if they are really after you," Colton retorted, wincing as Constance cleaned his injured arm. The captured man, facing the gallows and offered leniency for information, revealed Blackwood's full plan. The land baron had been losing influential support due to Charles's campaigning and feared Constance's testimony would be the final blow. He dispatched multiple groups to intercept them, with orders to leave no witnesses. Most damning, the man admitted Blackwood had personally shot Richard Whitfield when he refused to sign over his land claim. He even revealed where documentation of Blackwood's illegal activities could be found hidden in his office safe. With this intelligence, they altered their course directly for Blackwood's ranch rather than Helena. Their enlarged party now included several men who'd suffered under Blackwood's tyranny and were eager for justice. The territorial marshal, alerted by a fast rider, would meet them there. The confrontation at Blackwood's sprawling headquarters was surprisingly anticlimactic. Many of his hired guns, sensing which way the wind was blowing, surrendered without resistance when faced with a determined posse backed by legal authority. Blackwood himself attempted escape, but was captured trying to flee with saddlebags full of cash and documents. Standing before the man who'd murdered her husband and nearly killed her, Constance felt an unexpected calm. Blackwood, older and less imposing than the monster of her nightmares, glared at her with impotent rage. "You should have died on that prairie," he spat. Colton stepped forward, his hand steady on Constance's back. But she didn't. Her journey didn't end in dust and fear, Blackwood. It led her to justice and to me. The trial in Helena lasted only 3 days. With multiple witnesses, including his own men, turning against him, Blackwood was convicted of murder, land fraud, and numerous other crimes. The judge sentenced him to hang, though few expected he would live that long. Too many in the prison had personal reasons to want him dead. For Constance, the verdict brought closure rather than joy. As they left the courthouse, she leaned against Colton, emotionally exhausted. "It's really over," she murmured. He nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Ready to start that new life we talked about?" She smiled up at him. More than ready. They were married the next day in Helena's small church, with Charles as best man and the handful of friends they'd made through their ordeal as witnesses. Constance wore a simple blue dress purchased with some of the money recovered from Blackwood, her legitimate property. The court had ruled as partial compensation for her husband's murder. Colton, uncomfortable in borrowed formal wear, nevertheless stood tall and proud as he spoke his vows. His voice, usually so controlled, broke slightly when he promised to cherish her all his days. "Never thought I'd find someone willing to share my isolated life," he told her as they walked from the church. "Never thought I'd want to. We don't have to be quite so isolated," she teased. "I've grown rather fond of your brother's company," Colton laughed. "Charles would visit more if there was a decent road. Maybe we'll work on that." Their return to the valley was a homecoming in the truest sense. The cabin welcomed them with familiar comfort, yet everything felt new in the light of their official union, and the freedom from Blackwood's threat over the summer. They began improvements, adding rooms, planting a larger garden, acquiring more livestock. Charles visited often, sometimes bringing supplies and mail from town, other times just staying to help with the expanding ranch. Word of Blackwood's defeat spread, and occasionally travelers would appear seeking Colton's guidance through the mountains, or simply to meet the couple whose stand against tyranny had become something of a local legend. By autumn, Constance had news that brought Colton to his knees when she told him she was expecting their first child, due in early spring. His joy was tempered only by protective concern, aware of the frontier's dangers for expectant mothers. "We'll go to Helena for the birth," he insisted. "Stay with Charles. Have a proper doctor," Constance agreed, touched by his worry. "Our child will have the best of both worlds, your strength and knowledge of this land, and whatever refinements I can teach from my upbringing." The winter passed peacefully, marked by preparations for both their journey to Helena and the baby's arrival. Constance sewed tiny garments while Colton crafted a cradle from polished pine. On snowy evenings, they debated names and planned for a future that now extended beyond themselves. In late February, earlier than expected, Constance went into labor during a sudden blizzard that made travel impossible. Colton, hiding terror behind a mask of calm, delivered his son with steady hands and a prayer in his heart. When the boy's lusty cry filled the cabin, he wept unashamedly. "Constance, he's perfect," he whispered, placing the swaddled infant in her arms. "You're both perfect." They named him Daniel Richard Grayson, Daniel for Colton's father, Richard in memory of the man whose death had inadvertently led Constance to a love deeper than she'd known possible. When spring came in earnest, they took their son to Helena for a proper blessing. Standing in the same church where they'd married, Constance looked at her husband cradling their child and marveled at life's unexpected turns. "What are you thinking?" Colton asked, noticing her pensive smile. "That endings and beginnings are often the same moment," she replied. "The day I thought my journey was ending in dust and fear was actually the beginning of everything that matters." He kissed her softly, their son nestled between them. "That day, I told you to start a new journey in my arms. Never imagined where it would lead us." "I did," Constance said with quiet certainty. "Not the details, perhaps, but when you found me, even half dead and terrified, something in me recognized you not as a rescuer but as home." 5 years later, the Grayson Ranch had grown into a prosperous operation. The original cabin remained at its heart, though expanded beyond recognition. Daniel, a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's sage-green eyes, had been joined by a sister, Elizabeth Hannah, whose arrival had been considerably less dramatic than her brother's. Constance stood on the porch watching Colton teach Daniel to ride his new pony, her daughter balanced on her hip. The valley spread before her, familiar now in all its moods and seasons. She'd come to love this land almost as much as the man who'd made it his home. Charles, who'd finally settled nearby with a wife of his own, rode up with the mail. Among the letters was one bearing an official Boston seal. Constance opened it with curiosity that turned to shock. "What is it?" Colton asked, noticing her expression as he approached with Daniel. "My cousin Margaret has died," she explained, scanning the formal language. "She had no children. She's left me her house and a substantial sum." She looked up, bewildered. "We're apparently quite wealthy now." That evening, after the children were asleep, they discussed this unexpected turn of fortune. "We could move to Boston," Constance said, though the words felt strange on her tongue. "Give the children educational opportunities, social advantages." Colton was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Is that what you want?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. "To return to city life?" Constance studied her husband's face, still handsome, though weathered by years of sun and wind, still capable of making her heart race with a single glance. She thought of their children, growing strong and free in this wild place, of the life they'd built from nothing but love and determination. "No," she said with absolute certainty. "This is our home. The money will be useful. We can improve the ranch, perhaps build a school for the children and others in the area." She took his hand. "But my place is here with you." The tension left his shoulders as he pulled her close. "For a moment there, you thought I might leave." She shook her head, smiling. "Colton Grayson, the day you found me bleeding on the prairie and said I could start a new journey in your arms, that was the day I found where I belong. Nothing will ever change that." Outside, a spring storm gathered, not unlike the one that had raged the night Daniel was born. But inside their home, surrounded by the family they'd created and the love they'd fought for, Constance and Colton held each other in perfect contentment, their journey together still unfolding with each passing day.